So what we think happened during the evolution of this plant, when humans started shaping its genetics, that you had selection for plants that were for fiber and seed, and then you had selection for drug potency. And as soon as this mutation pops up in a population that knocks out CBD synthase, you start producing plants with a lot more THC. So I'm going to conclude with the last section on cannabis as medicine, which will bring us back to this idea that we are shaping the evolution of this species. It's interesting that the American Medical Association reversed a long-standing anti-marijuana position in 2009, stating that smoked cannabis indeed can reduce pain, improve appetite, may relieve spasticity, so on and so forth. And there's just too few studies. Many conditions have been proposed that are being considered now in clinical studies with the National Institutes of Health for using cannabis as medicine. This is really nothing new. In fact, the U.S. pharmacopoeia, as dating back to its origin in the 19th century, had cannabis listed as a medicine and recommended for treatments of a number of these conditions. How it works has to do with the neurotransmitters that regulate signaling between our nerve cells throughout our nervous system, in our brain as well as our peripheral nervous system. The work that was done studying marijuana as a drug of abuse discovered a receptor molecule that sits in the membrane between one neuron and the next. And they called these cannabinoid receptors, and when they were first discovered, some concluded that these receptors are here because God wanted us to get high. But the only reason we call them endocannabinoid receptors is because we didn't know what our body produced at the time that would bind to those same receptors. And it turns out we do now, and it's a molecule called anandamide. It's a very important molecule that regulates signaling in our nervous system. We transmit electrochemical signals from one nerve cell to the next through this complicated process of factors binding to a receptor that then changes chemistry, and neurotransmitters are released. They bind to receptors in the adjacent cell, and our bodies produce this anandamide that does this. And in fact, these cannabinoid receptors are some of the most abundant neuroreceptors in the human body, and it just so happens that THC interacts with them. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over some of this stuff. This is a counter position from the Office of National Drug Control Policy on some of the negative health effects related to cannabis use, memory, cognitive function, smoking cannabis. Well, inhaling burning plant material is just generally not a good idea. It can cause cancer. And then there is this interesting statistical association between cannabis use and mental illness. Cause and effect isn't clear, but there are quite a few studies indicating that cannabis use can exacerbate symptoms of schizophrenia, particularly in those individuals who have a history of mental illness. And this is quite controversial, but it's something to bear in mind. And it's something that drug control policy really emphasizes, recognizing that the THC content of cannabis is higher now than it ever has been. And if you look at this picture from this is Golden Guide again. potency of the average cannabis seized by the federal government, maybe 2 to 3%. Back in this, 40 years ago today, it's averaging 20%. How does that happen? Well, breeders have been selecting for plants that produce the most THC. And this selection has been taking place. And we've been pushing the plant as far as we can. And this is what the DEA would like to point out, that marijuana today is more dangerous than it was in the past as a result of this selective breeding. But then you have physicians, health professionals who are rejecting this position and really starting to think differently about cannabis, like Sanjay Gupta on CNN. He was not at all a proponent of cannabis until the story of Charlotte Figi came along, which he profiled in his documentary. This is a girl suffering from a rare form of epilepsy, hundreds of seizures a day. Her parents tried everything. They tried a high dose of CBD and found that her symptoms just vanished. And so all of a sudden, a great deal of interest in not THC, but CBD. And it turns out, going back to neurotransmitters, that THC, I already mentioned, binds directly to this cannabinoid receptor. Well, CBD, that closely related cannabinoid, it doesn't bind directly to the cannabinoid receptors, but it indirectly acts with the breakdown of the anandamide molecule and triggers very different kinds of neurological effects. So where we get this euphoria out of THC binding to our cannabinoid receptor, the indirect effect of CBD on the transmission of signals throughout our nervous system seems to have effects like controlling spasticity, epilepsy, Parkinson's-like tremor. So how did we get to Charlotte's Web? Charlotte's Web was the name of a strain of cannabis that was produced in Colorado by some of these marijuana growers. They noticed that they had this plant that looks just like high potency marijuana, but it's got lots of CBD and very little THC. They have not disclosed how they did it, but I have a pretty good idea based on our experiments. And I think what they did our experiment where they crossed hemp and marijuana, they got the hybrid, but instead of selecting for high THC plants, they just selected for high CBD plants. And that's how they got Charlotte's Web. And I think what I've heard is about half of the hemp currently being grown in Kentucky is being grown for CBD production. Because in order to get a dose of CBD, you need to take a lot more of it than a dose of THC, because of its indirect effects. You really have to swamp the nervous system with this CBD. So it's very interesting, very complex subject, still controversial, but I can tell you, I think the difference between hemp and marijuana is quite simple and genetic. There's a lot about medical cannabis in terms of questions that we need to answer. I don't think we're going to improve public policy in the right direction without more research, but it's been virtually impossible to get this kind of basic funded because agencies are very reluctant to touch a controversial subject, and investors want an immediate return, which none of the work I described has any hope of providing. We're now looking in Minnesota at feral hemp. This is ditchweed. We've got ditchweed all throughout our river valleys. Thanks to a small industry grant from Dr. Bronner's Magic Soaps. They use a lot of hemp oil in their products. We are acquiring hemp germplasm for breeding. It took me 3 years, but we did get DEA approval to make a seed collection in Minnesota. And this was assisted by our own Minnesota Hemp Act, signed into law last year. We're way behind Kentucky in this, but we're trying. So last September, my assistant and I went out to an undisclosed location with our federally approved lockbox. It's a gun safe for transporting the feral hemp back to our laboratory, where we're initiating a program to understand how this plant has been changing and adapting to our local climate over the last 70 years in the absence of any selection by hemp farmers. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for the opportunity to speak on this topic, and be glad to take a question or two.
Thank you, Professor Weiblen. Yeah, folks who've got questions, please come to the microphones on the side, and we will take you guys. Come on. Go ahead, sir.
Yes. Let me get this correct. In 2014, SB 124 was signed by the governor, but for medical marijuana use. However, the way the legislation was written, it stated that the prescription, and I think this was mostly for epilepsy, had to be approved, had to have a written order by the physician. And that became, although it had been approved by the legislature and signed by the governor, it hasn't, that has been a major obstacle. That's my first question. The second question is, what would be, there have been a number of, there are about 8 different types of industrial use for hemp. Which of, in your readings, would you say would be the most, have the greatest possibilities for growth in here in Kentucky? And I'm thinking basically on the difficult, the higher unemployment areas in Kentucky, and in the eastern Kentucky, where they are really looking forward to having some kind of alternative to the coal industry.
Thank you. So I think you must be referring to, are you referring to Kentucky legislation on medical
Yes.
cannabis?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not familiar with how that's played out. But on the second question, I can give you some insight there. It's right now, it is CBD oil that offers immediate, there's an immediate market for that, and the prices are extremely high right now in CBD oil. Everyone who's involved recognizes that as soon as it goes into major production, there's going to be a bubble is going to burst. You know, but last time I checked, CBD oil was selling for $50,000 a kilo. It's yeah. So, but then that's going to pop. That's not sustainable. No one thinks it will be. But basically, I understand like half the 4,000 acres in production right now is for hemp oil, or not for hemp oil, for CBD oil, and that oil has to be extracted from the plant. It's labor intensive. You need all that processing in place to do it. There's all kinds of issues with, the safety of the oil, that is sold. But that seems to be the most promising right now. Beyond that, and what we're looking at in Minnesota is very much at grain, because there's a established and growing market in grain.